Hello, welcome to the Maya Toolbelt. This is Michael. Today we're going to talk about surfaces square. This is a tool that's probably not used as often as some of these other ones like revolve and extrude, but one I wanted to go over. And you can find it in the surfaces module. This little pull down menu here, go to animation, polygons, surfaces, and then the actual surfaces menu, square. Okay, what is square? Square and boundary are very similar. You'll notice in the menu, whenever they have these little lines to partition the different tools, boundary and square are together. Square, like boundary, uses curves to create a perimeter that you would create a surface in between. Unlike boundary, square requires four curves, hence the name square. It also requires that the curves intersect. Boundary did not require intersection necessarily, and square has some options here, like open them up here, for a lot more surface curve use as opposed to just typical curve use. Although you can just use normal curves, and we'll talk about both surface curves and normal curves while we're going through these options. So first, I'm just going to create four curves really quickly just to demonstrate the basics of how square works. We'll go to Create CV Curve Tool, and you can use any curve tool you want. And I'll just click in a couple times and make four curves in a square shape. I'm not going to necessarily worry about snapping the ends of the curves together. I just need the curves to intersect. So I'm going to make it a flat square. I'm not going to have a lot of waviness in it for this particular demonstration. I'll hide the grid so you can see the curves more cleanly, or clearly I should say. So here I have four curves, square patch pattern, intersecting but not adhered at the ends. Now another rule for a square is you have to select them in order, either clockwise or counterclockwise around the square. Unlike boundary, you didn't necessarily have to do that. So I'm going to select them in order, surfaces, square, and hit the 5 key to bring up shaded view, and you'll see that it just fills in that area where the curves have delineated a shape. You'll see this is also unlike boundary. If I were to, let's go ahead and compare the two. I'm going to move this to the side. This is my square surface, and I'm going to use these same curves and create a boundary surface. Surfaces boundary, and you can notice right off the bat that boundary uses these curves as influencers on creating the shape and not dictators when it comes to how the shape is made. Boundary is a little bit more flexible in that sense. Also, like I said before, the curves for a boundary do not necessarily have to intersect. If I were to move these points on this curve, it will break the square surface, but not break the boundary surface. So boundary, it has a little bit more flexibility, but with square you get a lot more precision. Let's say if I just wanted this surface to be between these four curves, I wanted this surface in between, boundary doesn't necessarily give you that. Without doing some tweaks to it. Square will get you that every time, and that's the basics really of how square works. But we of course don't just talk about basics. We're going to go into all the options and settings and see what we can do with this thing. So I'm going to delete my boundary surface. Don't need that anymore. I'll go ahead and delete my square too. I'll go ahead. I'll keep these curves and open up the options for surfaces square. Several different options, and like I said before, some of these are dealing with surface curves as opposed to what we have here, which are normal, just straight up curves. The continuity type is the first one. I'm going to edit, reset, make sure I have my default settings. Continuity type, fixed boundary, tangent, and implied tangent. And you'll see that the next setting, curve fit checkpoints, are only available for the tangent continuity type. Endpoint tolerance. This is similar to the boundary endpoint tolerance, where the ends don't necessarily have to intersect as long as they are within the tolerance. Then you can set a local one or use the global tolerance. And I'll get back to that in a minute. Then rebuild. You can rebuild these curves based on the order that you selected them. And you'll see that there's checkboxes for 4 curves. You can only use this command with 4 curves. And then output geometry, just like all the others that we've talked about. You can output NURBS or polygons or subdivisional surfaces or Bezier. And polygons, like I've said before, I have a video going over all of these settings for outputting polygons. It's in the Convert NURBS to Polygons videos I've made. You can click over here and check those out. I don't want to necessarily add another half hour to this video going over all these settings that I've already talked about, so please feel free to look at that video if you're interested in the output polygons settings, which are identical to the converting NURBS to polygons settings, which can be found under Modify, Convert, NURBS to Polygons, Options, same stuff. Let's go back to Square. Square 1. Okay. Edit, reset again, and let's go to the first one. Continuity type, by default, tangent. Now, tangent, this continuity type is the default setting, which makes me believe that the people who made Maya definitely assume you're going to use surface curves for the square command, because this only works if you're using surface curves. So fixed boundary is what we'd probably use better with this setup that we have here. Hit apply. It does the same thing essentially, but fixed boundary as opposed to, let's do tangent. Yeah, not much difference in this particular scenario, because I believe that if tangent is not found, because there is no surface curves involved, it will default back to a fixed boundary continuity type. And one way you can kind of see that, if I delete that one, if I select my square surface, minimize my tools here, and go to my inputs, you'll see here that my endpoint tolerance and all these settings are right here to use. If you hit the Show Manipulator tool, you'll see some icons appear in your scene, and you'll see that they're all set to fixed. If I click these, you can change the continuity type of each curve separately. So here I have continuity type as tangent, but you'll notice that it was, when I turned this on the first time, let me go back to the initial state, they said fixed. Let me change this to black maybe. What's easier to see? Let's try gray. So you can see this one for sure. Fixed, fixed, and these two over here also say fixed. So even though I had tangent selected for my continuity type, it defaulted to fixed boundary because tangent was not found, because I'm not using surface curves. And if you click through here, you'll see, if I click it once, you'll see it says tangent failed. It could not find tangent. I can go to implied. Implied will work. What implied does is it uses the implied tangent of the curve based on how it is built or laid out. So because this curve is drawn in such a way that it can kind of imply what a tangent would be if this was a surface curve, that's kind of what that means. And you can see a little bit of an adjustment. It's very subtle in this case because the curves are pretty flat. So before we move on to surface curves, I want to just do this again with a set of curves that are not so flat, just so you can see a difference. So with these though, I want to go ahead and snap them at the end points just to make things a little bit easier to work with. So I'm going to right click on my curve, select Control Vertex, grab this one at the end, hold down C for snap to curve, middle click and drag on this curve and drag it to the end. I'll do the same for these others. Okay, move this point over here. Hold down C, middle click and drag on my curve, and we'll snap to that curve. Okay, so now I have a more enclosed square shape without worrying about my curves not being intersecting or touching at the ends. And now I'll make these a little bit more interesting by adjusting their shape some, so they'll get some wave in here, not so flat. Okay, and now I'll select them in clockwise or counterclockwise order. Edit, reset, and because tangent obviously has no effect, I'm going to go ahead and use fixed boundary. Endpoint tolerance, we can keep that global since the endpoints are touching, and we're going to get back to this in a second. I'm going to go ahead and apply. So you see it's much like boundary in the sense that it will use the curve shape to kind of imply what the middle of the surface should be like. It kind of blends from one to the other. And we still have history like any other thing we do in Maya. If I adjust these curve shapes after the fact, the surface will adjust and change shape accordingly. You just don't want to break them from touching because that will break the surface. And you need to make sure that you have 4 curves or this won't work. Okay, so now let's go back to Show Manipulator again with my square input selected. You'll see I have the fixed icons over here, the fixed labels on these 4 curves, indicating that we're using fixed boundary as our continuity type. And we can change these to tangent, which fails because it's not a surface curve, or implied, and it gets a little bit adjusted based on what the implied tangent might be. So very subtle difference. I'm going to create a NURB sphere. So to create a surface curve, you can do different things. You can select an isoparm and use it as a surface curve just by selecting it whenever you're selecting curves to create your square. I think we're going to go a different route, and we're going to make this NURB sphere live and draw surface curves onto it. And if you want to know about Make Live, check out the Make Live video. Click over here to go see it. I go over, it's a really short video just talking about Make Live and what it does. But just briefly, it essentially makes your surface available to draw on or create things on, just like you could on the grid in your scene. So I'm going to select a sphere, go to Modify, Make Live. It changes color a bit to indicate that it is a live surface I can draw a curve on now. Go to Create, CV Curve Tool, and I'm just going to draw all 4 of my curves on this sphere. Now I hit the Make Live or go to Modify, Make Not Live. So now my sphere is no longer live and I can move it around. So I had my 4 surface curves here. They are attached to this sphere, and so the tangent of the sphere is what we're going to use for the continuity type. So to do that, I'm going to have to select these 4 curves in order, and it's a little difficult to select them on the curve unless you hit 4 for the wireframe. So it might be a little difficult to see in the video, but I'm going to select them here in order. I'll go back to shaded now that I have them selected, and go to Edit, Reset for my square surface tangent, which will be used now since we have actual tangents to pull from, and hit Apply. And we'll notice that my surface was not created. That's probably because these curves may not be intersecting the way they need to be. So real quick, I'll just snap them here and until it works. Snap them here. There we go. So now the surface is made. And let me hide the sphere. Control H to hide. Alright, so here's the surface that got created now, based on those 4 curves, those 4 surface curves. I should be more specific. And if I go to my square input here, you'll see I have a lot more curved inputs for curve from surface options. Similar to a subcurve, you can change what percentage of the curve is being used to create the square, but because the endpoints of the curve are matching right now, it kind of helps to have these set to their normal 0 to 1. But anyway, selecting the square input, go back to Show Manipulator, and you'll see now they're using tangent, and the tangent option did not fail in this case. If I click it and go to Implied, it adjusts, it slightly changes it, fixed. It's very subtle, but tangent works nicely when you're dealing with surface curves. Let's delete that surface, bring back my sphere by hitting Control-Shift-H, and we're going to look at more options using these surface curves. Curve Fit Checkpoints is the next one on the list, and this is only available when using the tangent continuity type. But what it simply does is it checks for 5 positions on each curve with the number set to 5. Curve fit checkpoints. It checks each curve 5 times along the curve to check the tangent of the curve at that point. And you can increase or decrease this. And like I said, implied tangent is just using the curve where it is and implying a tangent based on that curve's shape, as opposed to using the actual tangent of the surface that the curve was made on. Okay, let's go to Endpoint Tolerance. This is very similar to the boundary option, where it allows a bit more leeway in how the curves intersect. A global endpoint tolerance is using a global setting that is set in Maya's preferences, which can be found under Window, Settings, Preferences, then go to Settings, and down here we have Tolerance. And in this case we're using Positional Tolerance, which by default is 0.0001. So when you're using global endpoint tolerance, you're using that global value. If you choose local, it grays out the tolerance slider here. You can adjust your own tolerance value. So you'll notice before when I was making these surface curves that the surface was not built, the square surface was not built by default. I had to kind of adjust the curves a little. I could have also adjusted this tolerance and it might have made the surface appear without having to adjust the curves positions. I guess we can demonstrate that real quick. Let me bring back my sphere. I'm going to go ahead and delete these 2 square shapes. Don't need them anymore. I'm going to select this surface curve and adjust its CV a little so it's not quite touching the other. I'll select them in order again. And first I'll use a global, so this is the same thing we had before, except now my curves are no longer touching here. And apply, no surface was made. If I adjust this control vertex to return to its original position, the surface then gets created. Let me undo that. Make sure I delete that surface. Square, delete that. Okay. So now with the curves still no longer touching, select them in order again. And this time I will use a local tolerance, and I'm just going to guess and raise this way up here to 1, all the way up to the end, hit apply, and now the surface gets created even though my curves are not touching. So that's what that tolerance allows you to do. Rebuild. I've gone over all the rebuild options before, and in this case they don't necessarily show you all those options, but what it's doing is you'll notice that my surface isn't the cleanest. If I go back to wireframe so I can select these curves and hit Control A to open the attribute editor, you'll see this curve has 6 spans over here in the attributes. This curve has 5, this curve has 5, and this curve has 6. Okay, so 2 have 6, 2 have 5. Because the spans are all different, it's having to create a bit more of a dense and uneven surface to adjust to all these different curve spans. If I were to, let's see, selecting them in the same order I've been selecting them means the first curve and the last curve are 6. while the second and third curve are 5. So I'm going to tell it to rebuild curve 2 and curve 3. Use tangent. I'll go ahead and increase this back to the default 5 curve checkpoints and hit apply, and you'll see that this surface is a bit cleaner than my old one. I'm going to duplicate this surface and move it over here and delete this one. I'm going to rebuild the surface again without rebuilding the curves, without these checkboxes, and we'll see a difference in the surface that gets created. Okay, let's minimize this stuff, bring up. So you'll see the general shape is the same. However, here you'll see I have these 2 lines that are right next to each other. These isoparms here. A lot of doubled lines. While over here, I know I don't have that default in the surface. So using the same number of spans on all 4 curves gets you a much cleaner result. And that's using the rebuild checkboxes, and again, whichever the order that you select the curves in indicates which ones are curve 1, 2, 3, or 4. And then last is output geometry we've already talked about. So that is Square in a nutshell. Very similar to Boundary, but also very different if you look at all these different settings that you can play with. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you learned a little bit. Like, comment, subscribe. I definitely appreciate it. If you have any suggestions or requests, if I missed anything, definitely let me know. And I appreciate your time, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.